The air hung thick, saturated with the cloying sweetness of myrrh and something else, something sharper, more metallic, a primal scent that clung to the marble like a shroud. 100 young men, vibrant with the bloom of youth, crossed the threshold of the queen's chambers. They would not see the dawn. What transpired that night in the heart of ancient Assyria was not the stuff of myth or legend, but a documented atrocity, a massacre so brutal, so utterly depraved, that it reverberates still, a chilling echo across the millennia. Queen Shamuramat, a name synonymous with both power and infamy, allegedly orchestrated this act of unspeakable horror in the year 810 BCE, forever staining her legacy. The evidence, though fragmented, is undeniable. Shards of clay tablets etched with desperate accounts, partially effaced inscriptions hinting at unimaginable events, the hushed whispers of historians who dared to chronicle what the empire sought to bury deep beneath the sands of time. Archaeological digs revealed anomalies, disturbing irregularities in palace inventories, a sudden influx of young male slaves, precisely 100, all described with an unsettling uniformity, unblemished of body, pleasing of face. They were not destined for labor, nor for war. Their purpose was far more sinister. The records also detailed the acquisition of vast quantities of peculiar herbs, mandragora root, poppy extract, potent substances known for their ability to lull the senses and shatter the boundaries of reality. What concoctions were brewed with these dark ingredients? A chilling convergence of clues points towards a premeditated ritual, a sacrifice on a scale rarely, if ever, witnessed in the ancient world. What dark god demanded this offering? Whispers of the queen's deeds reached beyond the borders of Assyria, carried by terrified merchants and disquieted diplomats. An envoy from Elam, in a missive to his king, wrote of the Assyrian court with palpable dread. The queen has wrought unspeakable acts. Servants speak in hushed tones of a night when the palace itself seemed to weep tears of blood. None who gaze upon her leave unchanged. I advise, with all the urgency I can muster, that we maintain a safe distance from this accursed court. Far better to face the blades of 1,000 warriors than the gaze of a single queen. Such pronouncements from a seasoned diplomat hardened by the realities of ancient warfare speaks volumes. It hints at horrors that transcended even the brutal norms of the age. Centuries later, modern forensic archaeology unearthed a mass grave near the ruins of the royal palace. Within lay the skeletal remains of 100 young men, all seemingly perished at the same moment. The layout of the bodies was not random. They were arranged with a disturbing precision, suggesting a ritualistic purpose. Traces of exotic substances mirroring the palace purchase records were discovered within the bone tissue, creating a sinister timeline that spanned nearly 3,000 years. The implications of this evidence were undeniable. The question that haunts historians is not if this event occurred, but why. What twisted logic could possibly justify such an act of barbarity? The answer, perhaps, lies in the treacherous currents of ancient Assyrian politics and the precarious position Shamuramat occupied as a female regent in a fiercely patriarchal society. Her very presence on the throne was seen by some as a violation of divine law. What actions would she take to secure her reign? The death of King Shamshi-Adad V in 811 BCE plunged the empire into a dangerous state of flux. Their son, Adad-nirari III, was but a child, too young to command the loyalty of ambitious generals and power-hungry nobles who saw their opportunity in the ensuing chaos. Shamuramat's rise to regency was unprecedented, requiring either unparalleled political maneuvering or a touch of something otherworldly. Some whisper that she employed both, weaving earthly conspiracies with fabricated divine mandates to legitimize her claim. What lengths would she go to? The kingdom's priests, initially resistant to a woman's rule, mysteriously became her most fervent supporters after a series of what modern scholars suspect were carefully staged miracles, a show of her own power to ward off those who question her rule. The priests became pawns in a game of power. External threats mirrored the internal turmoil. The Babylonians to the south, sensing weakness, began to mobilize their forces. The Medes to the east launched provocative raids into Assyrian territory. The Armenian kingdoms to the north openly challenged the legitimacy of a woman's reign. Each threat demanded not just military might, but a potent demonstration of supernatural strength. In the ancient Near East, where kingship was inextricably linked to divine favor and otherworldly power, conventional politics often proved insufficient. So how would the queen survive? It was within this context of existential crisis that Shahmuramat conceived her terrible solution. What lengths would she go to protect her and her son's legacy? Ancient Mesopotamian religion placed immense importance on sacrifice as a means of securing divine intervention. The gods, particularly Ishtar, were believed to bestow power in direct proportion to the value of the offering. And how much was a kingdom to a queen? Human sacrifice, while officially frowned upon under Assyrian law, was not unheard of in times of desperate need. What set Shahmuramat's alleged act apart was its scale and its unsettling fusion of the sacred and the profane. The selection process for the 100 victims seemed meticulously planned, steeped in ritualistic significance. What would the rituals entail? Administrative tablets detail months of preparation. The young men were housed in a special wing of the palace, fed the finest foods, bathed in precious oils, and instructed in mysterious sacred duties by the queen's personal priestesses. Their lives stripped away to become objects for a ritual. They were isolated from the outside world, denied all contact with family and friends. Guards reported strange chants emanating from their quarters at night. What strange rituals were being taught? Several attempted escapes were brutally suppressed, so they were held against their will to become victims of the queen's power grab. Religious scholars have drawn parallels between this grooming process and ancient fertility rituals, particularly those associated with the Sumerian goddess, Ishtar's predecessor. The past is a mirror. What horrors would be repeated? These rituals often involved a symbolic marriage between a young man and the goddess, represented by a high priestess, intended to ensure agricultural abundance and military victory. How this ritual was to be performed was now in the hands of the queen. However, these ceremonies typically involved symbolic death and rebirth, not literal murder. Shahmuramat seemingly twisted an ancient metaphorical practice into something horrifyingly tangible. What had once been a symbolic dance between mortal and goddess was to be turned into bloodshed. The night of the massacre is shrouded in contradictory accounts and deliberate obscuration. Palace records for that date are conspicuously absent, either destroyed during the event itself or in its immediate aftermath. The queen had sought to erase history, but stories never truly die. However, fragmented documents offer tantalizing glimpses into the preparations. Orders for vast quantities of wine mixed with mysterious sacred herbs, the dismissal of all palace staff except for a select group of priestesses, the sealing of the palace gates at sunset with strict instructions that none should enter or leave until dawn. What secret rites were to be committed behind closed doors? The primary account of the events comes from a palace scribe who claimed to have hidden in an adjacent chamber, witnessing the horrors through a crack in the wall. His tablet, discovered in the 1920s and authenticated through multiple dating methods, provides a narrative so disturbing that early translators hesitated to publish it in its entirety. What would they find if they did? According to this witness, the 100 young men were brought into the queen's grand chamber in groups of 10, each group assigned to a station marked by ritual symbols on the floor. The stage had been set, the actors prepared. Shahmuramat, adorned in the full regalia of Ishtar, including the goddess's distinctive horned crown, presided over an elaborate ceremony that began with dancing and sacred chanting. She became the deity she revered. The young men, heavily drugged with the wine mixture, initially participated willingly, seemingly believing they were partaking in a sacred marriage ritual that would elevate them to divine status. They were told they were to become gods. The presence of temple priestesses, nude save for jewelry depicting religious symbols, reinforced this illusion of sacred ceremony. Naked bodies danced for the coming death. As the night deepened, the true nature of the ritual became brutally apparent. How long would it take them to realize? The scribe's account becomes increasingly fragmented at this point, whether due to trauma or deliberate censorship. He describes scenes of escalating violence disguised as religious ecstasy, the horrors too much for him to bear. The drugged wine contained not just sedatives, but potent hallucinogens, blurring the line between reality and religious vision. The mind melted, and the body became clay. Victims were told they were dying and being reborn as divine beings, even as they were systematically murdered through methods the scribe refused to fully detail. What dark practices unfolded in the Crimson Chamber? The scribe's account is particularly credible because of its inclusion of details only an eyewitness could have known. He describes specific individuals among the victims, including a young Babylonian captive who attempted to break free and was struck down by the queen herself, wielding a ceremonial dagger. She drew blood herself. He mentions the deliberate arrangement of bodies into patterns forming religious symbols when viewed from above, a detail later confirmed by archaeological evidence from the burial site. So every action was part of a grand design. Most tellingly, he describes Shama-Ramat's emotional state throughout the ordeal. Not as a madwoman lost in bloodlust, but as a calculating ruler performing what she believed to be a necessary evil. She had made her choice. The immediate aftermath of the massacre was meticulously orchestrated, as carefully planned as the event itself. What came next was as important as what came before. By dawn, specialized teams of slaves, themselves later executed to ensure silence, had removed the bodies and cleansed the chamber. The bloody stage needed to be cleansed. The official story, propagated through royal decree, was that the young men had been taken by Ishtar to serve as her divine consorts in the afterlife, a supreme honor demonstrating the goddess's special favor toward Assyria, a lie told to hide a massacre. Those who dared question this narrative faced swift execution for blasphemy. Silence was paramount. The psychological impact on those who knew the truth was profound. They carried a burden the empire sought to bury. The scribe who provided the eyewitness account concluded his tablet with a personal note. "I no longer sleep. When I close my eyes, I see their faces. Beautiful boys transformed into corpses, their dead eyes reflecting the queen's gold crown. I write this knowing it may cost me my life, but someone must remember. Someone must bear witness to what power demands of those who would keep it. I must bear witness, or it would all be for nothing." The tablet was hidden in a sealed jar, clearly intended for discovery by future generations. The dead whisper through time. Shama-Ramat's transformation following the massacre was remarked upon by all who encountered her. She had changed, a before and after marked by blood. Foreign ambassadors described a woman who radiated an almost supernatural authority, whose mere presence could silence a room full of hardened warriors. She radiated power, and those who knew her secrets knew why. Her political enemies, previously vocal in their opposition to female rule, suddenly fell silent or disappeared entirely. The message was clear: cross the queen and you will disappear. Even her own son, as he grew older, seemed to regard his mother with a mixture of awe and terror that transcended normal filial respect. Even her son feared her. The military successes that followed seemed to validate the horrific sacrifice. The ends justify the means. Within months of the massacre, Assyrian armies achieved stunning victories against their enemies. The Babylonian forces, previously advancing on Assyrian territory, retreated in apparent panic after their scouts reported ominous signs surrounding the Assyrian queen. They ran from the terror they could not fight. The Medes abandoned their raids and sued for peace. The Armenian kingdom sent tribute and hostages without being asked. What fear she created! Whether through psychological warfare, divine intervention, or sheer coincidence, Shama-Ramat's gambit appeared to have worked. She had won the gamble she placed. However, the cost of such power extended far beyond the 100 dead youths. It was a debt paid in the soul. Palace records from subsequent years reveal an increasingly isolated queen, surrounded by fearful servants and sycophantic priests, but genuinely trusted by none. She had become a prisoner of her own power. Her relationship with her son deteriorated as he grew older, possibly due to his growing awareness of the methods she had used to secure his throne. Could he ever forgive her? When she finally relinquished the regency, she retreated to a private palace where she lived her remaining years in luxurious solitude, visited only by the priestesses who had participated in her dark ritual. They were the only ones she could trust, or those who knew too much to abandon. The cover-up of the massacre continued long after Shamaramat's death. The need to forget. Her son, now ruling as Adad Nirari III, systematically erased or altered records of his mother's regency. Official inscriptions were recarved to minimize her role, and new histories were commissioned that transformed her into a semi-mythical figure whose actual deeds were obscured behind legendary accomplishments. Truth became myth, and myth became legend. This deliberate mythologization had an unintended consequence. It preserved the memory of Shamaramat, even as it distorted it, ensuring that echoes of her dark deeds would survive in the collective memory of the ancient world. Her actions were never truly forgotten. Greek historians, encountering these echoes centuries later, wove them into the legend of Semiramis, the mythical queen who built Babylon and conquered much of Asia. History is written by the victors. In their accounts, the historical massacre became transformed into tales of the queen's insatiable sexual appetite and her habit of killing lovers after a single night of passion. Her story was rewritten to fit a narrative of lust and power. While these Greek versions sensationalized and distorted the original events, they preserved the core truth. This was a woman who had crossed moral boundaries that even the ancient world found shocking. She was a monster in a crone. The influence of Shamaramat's actions extended far beyond her own reign, or even her own empire. Her actions had consequences. The spectacular success of her blood sacrifice created a dangerous precedent that other rulers would attempt to follow, a spark to ignite the flame of madness. Archaeological evidence suggests a marked increase in large-scale ritual killings across the Near East in the decades following her regency. What she started, others would continue. Kings and queens facing similar crises began to employ what historians now term Shamaramat solutions, massive sacrificial offerings designed to secure divine intervention in political affairs. The world had learned her lesson. One particularly well-documented case occurred in the city of Carchemish about 40 years after the original massacre. History repeats itself. Facing invasion by a coalition of enemies, the city's king ordered the sacrifice of 50 young warriors in a ceremony explicitly modeled on the great offering of the Assyrian queen. He sought to imitate her success. The ritual failed spectacularly. The city fell within days, and the king was executed by his own people, who blamed the sacrifice for angering the gods. There is no shortcut to power. This and similar failures gradually discredited the practice, though isolated incidents continued for centuries, yet her influence still lingered. The religious implications of Shamaramat's actions reverberated through Mesopotamian theology. Her actions changed the course of belief. The goddess Ishtar, in whose name the massacre was supposedly committed, underwent a transformation in how she was perceived and worshipped. The goddess became stained with blood. Previously associated with love and fertility as much as war and death, post-Shamarama depictions increasingly emphasized her darker aspects. Her image was changed forever. Temple rituals became more violent, and her priestesses gained a reputation for dangerous occult practices that made them both feared and sought after across the ancient world. The priests became monsters in their own rights. Archaeological excavations at Ishtar temples from this period have uncovered disturbing evidence of how worship practices changed. Ritual implements designed for symbolic ceremonies were replaced with functional weapons. Temple decorations shifted from scenes of sacred marriage and fertility to depictions of death and transformation. What had once been sacred was now profane.
Most tellingly, the remains of sacrificial victims, previously limited to animals and occasional criminals, showed a marked increase in young, healthy individuals who appeared to have been ritual offerings rather than judicial executions. The offering to the gods required the best, and the young were the best. The psychological profile of Shamaaramat that emerges from historical analysis is that of a woman driven by extraordinary circumstances to commit extraordinary acts. The past has become a study for future generations. Modern psychiatrists studying the available evidence have proposed various diagnoses, from narcissistic personality disorder to a form of religious psychosis induced by the extreme stress of her position. How could the doctors of now understand the pressures of then? However, such retroactive analysis fails to account for the calculated nature of her actions and their effectiveness in achieving her political goals. She had her reasons, and her actions had their results. More compelling is the interpretation that views Shamaaramat as a rational actor operating within the brutal logic of her time and position. The world she knew was filled with brutality. Faced with the likelihood that she and her son would be murdered by political rivals, she chose to commit one massive atrocity that would secure their survival through supernatural terror. A choice between death and bloodshed. The fact that it worked, that she successfully maintained power and passed it to her son, suggests a deep understanding of the psychology of power in the ancient world. The power she wielded was brutal and uncompromising. The question of whether Shamaaramat experienced guilt or remorse for her actions remains unanswerable. The few personal documents that survive from her later years are formal and unrevealing. Did she regret her actions? However, there are intriguing hints in the archaeological record, whispers of the past. Her private palace included an unusual chamber described in inventories as the Room of Remembrance, which contained 100 lampstands arranged in precise patterns. She remembered her victims. Servants were required to keep all lamps burning continuously at enormous expense, an eternal flame for the dead. Some historians interpret this as a form of penance, an eternal vigil for the victims of her ambition, her regret made tangible. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed additional layers to this complex story, secrets found in the soil. Chemical analysis of residues found in the palace chambers has identified compounds consistent with ancient chemical weapons, toxic gases that could be released through hidden mechanisms in the walls. How much of the story was true? This suggests that the massacre may have involved even more sophisticated methods than contemporary accounts described. There may have been more to the story. The victims may have been killed by poisonous vapors even as they believed they were experiencing divine visions, their deaths as horrific as they were. The discovery of similar chemical traces in other royal palaces of the period indicates that Shamaaramat's methods were studied and replicated by subsequent rulers. The darkness spread. A hidden tradition of palace chemistry developed, passed down through generations of court poisoners and ritual specialists, knowledge gained in blood. Cuneiform tablets discussing the queen's formula have been found as far away as Egypt and Anatolia, suggesting a widespread network of practitioners inspired by her original innovation. Her legacy was bloodshed. The role of the priestesses in the massacre deserves special attention. They were the keys. These women, whose names were deliberately erased from all records, were essential accomplices in the horror, their names taken for their crimes. Their motivations remain mysterious. Were they true believers convinced they were serving their goddess? Opportunists seeking power through association with the queen? Or victims themselves, coerced into participation? Were they true believers or pawns in a game? The few indirect references to them in surviving texts suggest they formed an inner circle around Shamaaramat that persisted even after the massacre. They were linked by the blood on their hands. A fragmentary text, apparently written by a former priestess seeking absolution before death, provides a unique perspective. She describes how the participants were selected from among the most ambitious and ruthless of Ishtar's servants, women who had already demonstrated their willingness to transgress normal boundaries in service to the goddess. They were monsters themselves. They underwent months of preparation, including rituals designed to harden their hearts against mercy, and theological instruction that reframed murder as a sacred act of transformation. They were taught to kill. The international response to the massacre, once news inevitably leaked beyond Assyria's borders, was complex and revealing. Rather than universal condemnation, the reaction of neighboring rulers was often admiration mixed with fear. She was feared and respected. Several attempted to recruit Shamauramat's priestesses for their own courts, offering enormous rewards for their expertise in divine transformation. They wanted the secret to her power. Others sent delegations seeking to learn the secrets of her success, viewing the massacre not as an atrocity but a masterful piece of statecraft. The world was brutal and unforgiving.
This moral relativism of the ancient world challenges modern readers who expect historical figures to conform to contemporary ethical standards. We can only judge them by our standards. In Shamauramat's time, the murder of slaves, even in large numbers, was not considered inherently immoral if it served state purposes. Lives were cheap. What made her actions shocking to her contemporaries was not the death toll, but the ritual context and the perceived sacrilege of corrupting sacred ceremonies. It was the how, not the what. She had taken practices meant to honor the gods and transformed them into tools of political power. The sacred became profane. The long-term consequences of Shamauramat's actions for the Assyrian Empire were profound and ultimately destructive. Her legacy was ruin. While her immediate goals were achieved, her son's throne was secured and Assyria's enemies were cowed, she had introduced a poison into the bloodstream of Assyrian politics. She had corrupted the empire. Subsequent rulers, lacking her intelligence and strategic vision, attempted to replicate her success through increasingly desperate acts of ritual violence. They could not wield her power. The empire gained a reputation for supernatural evil that made diplomatic relations difficult and encouraged enemies to unite against the common threat. Fear can only hold someone for so long. By the time of Assyria's final collapse in 609 BCE, the empire that had once dominated through military might and administrative efficiency had become synonymous with occult horror and ritual atrocity. The empire had become a monster. The biblical prophets' descriptions of Assyria as a kingdom of sorcerers and blood drinkers, while exaggerated, reflected a genuine transformation in how the empire was perceived. She had made them monsters. Shamauramat's success had cursed her successors with the expectation that they, too, could solve political problems through spectacular sacrilege. The price of power was blood. The preservation and transmission of this story through millennia raises important questions about historical memory and the human fascination with extreme transgression. Why do we remember such horror? Why did ancient scribes risk their lives to record these events? Why did subsequent generations continue to copy and hide these dangerous texts? What made them so compelling? The answer may lie in the fundamental human need to bear witness to evil, to ensure that even the most powerful cannot erase their crimes from history. The dead must be remembered. Modern scholars studying Shamauramat face unique challenges. Much of the evidence has been deliberately destroyed or distorted, requiring careful reconstruction from fragmented sources. The truth is hidden. The sensational nature of the story attracts both serious researchers and conspiracy theorists, making it difficult to separate legitimate historical inquiry from fantasy. Fact and fiction are easily blurred. The intersection of archaeology, religious studies, psychology, and forensic science necessary to understand the full scope of events requires unprecedented interdisciplinary cooperation. Only together can we find the answer. Recent discoveries continue to add new dimensions to our understanding. In 2019, excavations at a site believed to be Shamauramat's private palace uncovered a hidden archive containing personal correspondence between the queen and her priestesses. Her secrets discovered. While most tablets were too damaged to read, advanced imaging techniques have recovered portions of text that provide intimate glimpses into the planning and aftermath of the massacre. We may yet learn the truth. One partially decoded tablet contains what appears to be a list of the victims' names, a humanizing detail that transforms abstract horror into personal tragedy. Names on stone, lives lost. The ethical implications of studying and publicizing such historical atrocities remain contentious. Should the past be let to rest? Some argue that detailed examination of ancient evil serves no purpose beyond satisfying morbid curiosity.
Others contend that understanding the extremes of human behavior, especially when cloaked in religious or political justification, is essential for preventing similar horrors. It is important to learn from the past. The story of Shamuramat forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between power, violence, and the sacred. How much power does it take to corrupt? Contemporary parallels, while necessarily different in specific context, are impossible to ignore. History rhymes. Modern history provides numerous examples of political leaders who have used ritual violence and religious justification to maintain power. History is repeating itself. The psychological mechanisms that allowed ancient populations to accept or rationalize mass murder remain active in human societies. The worst of mankind never changes. Shamuramat's story serves as a warning about the dangerous intersection of political ambition, religious authority, and the human capacity for evil, a warning that rings true even today. The question of justice, delayed by 3 millennia, still haunts this narrative. The 100 young men who died in the Queen's bedchamber received no earthly justice. Their killer died peacefully in her bed, honored by history, even as it forgot her victims. Is there any justice? Their names, recovered from that damaged tablet, represent the only memorial they have ever received. Ashadan, Nabushar, and Lilbani, Shamash, Ibni. Each name a life cut short, a future destroyed, a family left to wonder what became of their son. Names in a ledger, lives lost in vain. Yet perhaps there is a form of justice in the story's preservation and telling. They were remembered. Shamuramat sought to use atrocity as a tool of power, to transform murder into myth. Instead, history has transformed her into a cautionary tale. Her tale is one of horror. A reminder that no amount of political success can wash clean the stain of innocent blood. Their blood stains her name. Her name survives not as she intended, as a powerful queen who saved her dynasty, but as a symbol of how power can corrupt even maternal love into something monstrous. She is remembered, but for her crimes. The archaeological site where the 100 bodies were found has been designated a memorial by the Iraqi government. A simple stone marker erected in 2021 bears an inscription in Akkadian and Arabic. Here lie 100 sons of Mesopotamia, victims of power's hunger. May their memory outlive their murderous glory. May the fallen be remembered. Visitors report an unusual atmosphere at the site, a heaviness in the air, a reluctance of birds to nest in nearby trees, unexplained cold spots even in the blazing summer heat. The dead are restless. Whether psychological projection or something more, the place remains marked by its terrible history. Modern DNA analysis of the remains has revealed another heartbreaking detail. Several of the victims were brothers, likely sold into slavery together and selected for their shared beauty, so they died as they lived, together. The thought of siblings facing death together, perhaps drawing comfort from familiar faces in their final moments, adds another layer of human tragedy to the historical horror. Their last moments of comfort stolen. These scientific revelations continue to transform abstract historical events into deeply personal human experiences. The influence of Shamuramat's story on literature and popular culture has been significant but often distorting. Fiction does not equal fact. From ancient Greek plays to modern novels, writers have been drawn to the dramatic potential of the narrative, while frequently missing its historical significance. The story is romanticized.
The tendency to romanticize or sexualize the violence does a disservice to both the perpetrator's calculated evil and the victim's suffering. They were not lovers, but victims. Responsible storytelling requires maintaining the distinction between historical documentation and entertainment. To remember is to honor. Educational institutions face challenges in teaching this history. How do we convey the reality of ancient atrocities without glorifying them? How do we help students understand different moral frameworks while maintaining clear ethical standards? How can we teach this lesson? The story of Shamuramat provides a powerful case study in the corruption of power, the manipulation of religion, and the human cost of political ambition. Her actions were a dark lesson in history. Used properly, it can illuminate dark corners of human nature while reinforcing the importance of moral boundaries. The question of what constitutes appropriate memorial for such events remains open. Unlike more recent atrocities, the victims of Shamuramit's massacre have no descendants to mourn them, no community to demand remembrance, only names on a list. They exist now only as archaeological artifacts and names on damaged tablets. Yet, their story, preserved against all odds, continues to speak across the centuries, demanding recognition and reflection. They must be remembered. As we near the conclusion of this dark journey through history, it's essential to consider what lessons Shamuramit's story offers for our own time. The specific methods may have changed, but the fundamental dynamics of power, violence, and justification remain constant in human societies. Leaders still invoke higher purposes to justify lower actions. It is still happening. Religious and ideological frameworks still provide cover for atrocity, the lie behind a truth. The 100 young men who died in that ancient bedchamber stand as eternal witnesses to the price of unchecked ambition. The final historical irony is that Shamuramit achieved her immediate goal, but failed in her ultimate purpose. Her power could not last. Her son retained the throne, but the dynasty she sacrificed so much to preserve lasted only a few more generations, and now is dust. The Assyrian Empire, which she sought to strengthen through supernatural terror, ultimately fell to more conventional forces. History always finds a way. The blood of innocents bought only temporary power, a lesson written in the ruins of once mighty palaces and the scattered fragments of broken tablets. The cost was too high. What remains is the story itself, a narrative so powerful that it survived deliberate suppression, linguistic changes, the fall of civilizations, and the passage of millennia. The story survives. In preserving and telling this tale, we perform a dual function, honoring the memory of the victims while warning future generations about the seductive danger of power without conscience. We must learn from our mistakes. The 100 men who entered Shamuramit's bedchamber that night have become immortal in the only way victims of power can, through the endurance of their story and its capacity to instruct and appall across the ages. Their story must continue to be told. In the end, we are left with a moment of profound historical horror that refuses to be forgotten or forgiven. The story lives on. A mother who murdered to protect her child, a queen who transformed atrocity into authority, a woman who wrote her name in history with the blood of innocence. She is the price of power. Shamuramit stands as one of antiquity's most complex and terrifying figures. Her story reminds us that the past is not a foreign country where different moral rules applied, but a mirror in which we can see the eternal human capacity for both greatness and monstrosity. The past is a mirror to the present. The ruins of ancient Assyria still dot the landscape of modern Iraq, silent testimonies to a civilization that once ruled through fear and military might. The past remembers. Among these ruins, if you know where to look, you can find the unmarked site where a queen once committed an act so terrible that 3,000 years have not been enough to wash away its stain. The stain can never be washed away. The wind that blows through these ancient stones carries no answers, only questions that each generation must confront anew. The wind whispers the questions. What are the limits of power? What price is too high for political survival? And how do we remember those whose only monument is the horror of their death? What is the price? As night falls over the ancient sites, one can almost imagine the scene that unfolded so long ago. The drugged wine, the ritual chants, the progressive realization of doom, the systematic transformation of life into death in service of power. The darkness gathers again. It remains a testament to human depravity that such imagination is not required. The historical record, fragmentary as it is, provides sufficient detail to reconstruct the nightmare. It lives on. Shamuramit's 100 victims achieved a terrible immortality, their deaths echoing through history as a warning written in blood that power without morality is the darkest force in human experience. They are remembered, and they warn us still. This is their story and hers,
preserved in clay and stone, in academic papers and archaeological reports, in the collective memory of a species capable of both creating beauty and destroying it in the most horrific ways imaginable, beauty and terror. May we have the wisdom to learn from it, the courage to face its implications, and the humanity to ensure that such calculated evil remains forever in the past, a cautionary tale rather than a template for future atrocity. We must learn from the past. In remembering the 100 who died, we affirm the value of every life sacrificed on the altar of ambition, and pledge that their deaths, though ancient, shall not be forgotten or repeated. They will be remembered.